Welcome to a Therapeutic Hour. I'm your host, Michelle Overton. Whether you're here because it feels dark, you feel stuck, or you simply want to understand yourself better, you're in the right place. With over 400 types of therapy out there, it's no wonder it's hard to know where to begin. Join me and my guests as we demystify therapy and support you to self-heal. So settle in, relax, and let's begin your journey inwards together. This is a Therapeutic Hour. Welcome to the last guest episode of Season 1 of a Therapeutic Hour for 2024. Today I'm joined by a clinical psychologist, Dr. Claire Plumbly, and Claire will be discussing the many different types of burnout people can experience, how burnout impacts on our nervous system, and importantly, how to soothe the nervous system to regain clarity, connection, and resilience. Let's dive in and learn how to manage burnout before it manages us. Oh, welcome, Claire.
Hi, Michelle.
Hello. Yes, so I've been really looking forward to having our conversation. I know it's been in the pipeline, should I say, for a little while. And so it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I've had already on the podcast, we've had a stress management consultant, a psychiatrist, and various psychotherapists. So you are the first clinical psychologist on the podcast. And so I thought that would be a great place for us to start. So sharing, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit about your journey on becoming a clinical psychologist and also the role of a psychologist, please.
Yeah, sure. The only thing with this question is I always feel like it's not a very interesting answer, but I will answer it. So I became a psychologist by doing my psychology A-level. I was one of the first cohort to come through when that was on offer. All felt very exciting to be able to do psychology at A-level because it was also new. And I liked the idea of being able to learn about how humans tick. So I did the A-level and then enjoyed it enough to go into doing it at undergraduate. So I went to uni and did it for 3 years there. And then after that, again, I just enjoyed it. And I thought, I quite like the idea of becoming a psychologist. And so I kind of had a look at what there was. To vaguely, for a short while, entertain the idea of becoming a forensic psychologist. But had an opportunity to talk to a clinical psychologist and thought that was quite interesting work. But to become a clinical psychologist, you have to get onto a 3-year doctoral training, which is funded by the NHS. They don't really like people to get on and start doing that until they've got experience with mental health services. So I did various experiences working as a nursing assistant and worked for the National Autistic Society as a care assistant, and did a bit of research assistant at the Institute of Psychiatry. And then I got onto the doctoral training and did my 3 years. And you do part-time placements in rotation, 6-month rotation, and you do part-time on the course, and you do a doctorate thesis. So it's very involved and intense, those 3 years. And then you plop out the other side with your doctorate and ready to work as a clinical psychologist usually in the NHS, but you can also get clinical psychologists working in, other teams, police and charities and things like this.
Oh, that is really interesting. I know that. So I have had the privilege of working with a couple of people in training when I worked at the University of Leicester. And if I remember correctly, there are very small cohorts on the courses. And so it's quite sought after. It's quite difficult to get on, isn't it?
Yes, it was a whole day of interviews, and presentations, and most people don't get on the first year they apply. So yes, and there were 25 of us, and we joked that you had to be called Claire because I think a quarter of us were called Claire.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. And could you tell us a little bit more just about the roles? So I know that we have the different levels, don't we? You've got your psychiatry. What I know is, so do please tell me more, is that I know that a clinical psychologist will do treatment plans.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, obviously, clinical psychologists will work in different types of teams. So you might get psychologists working in a psychology service, but sometimes you might get them also working in a physical health service, or different kind of places where physical ailments or addictions also kind of happen. So psychologists will often do a lot of work with clients, often in a one-to-one capacity, but not always. We also do group work, and we also do consultations with people, members of staff who are working around a client or thinking about the journey of a client through a service. So thinking of whole service delivery as care. So we're quite good at thinking about the context that someone might be having and how to make sure everything is delivered in a compassionate way. Psychologists are much more likely to do what's called a formulation rather than diagnose. So what that means is we're looking at what's gone on for someone in their life. We're asking questions like, well, what's happened to you? What did you learn to do to cope with those things? We are less likely to ask questions that are kind of considered to be more of a medical model approach, which is what's wrong with you. We tend to have an assumption that the things and behaviors and behavior patterns and physical reactions make sense based on probably some adversity due to all sorts of different reasons, inequality,
All of that.
stereotypes, discrimination, poverty, all these things, as well as like more kind of classically considered traumatic events, like assaults or, child abuse and things like this. But all of this has an impact on our well-being. So psychologists will usually look at that and see, and then obviously develop a pathway out of that stuckness. So that might be offering different types of tools, cognitive tools, systemic tools, which means supporting people and how they're interacting with others in their system, how others are responding to them, and thinking about making that a smoother transaction, and sometimes also supporting people to advocate and empowering them to kind of see where the power imbalances are and shining a light more on that. I think there's a lot of really good work psychologists are doing on social media, for example, with that, and more outreachy type things. But so yeah, we've got quite a breadth of different things we can do, and yeah, you'll find us creeping up in all sorts of different places.
Yes. Yes, and so this leads me to, because so I have recently read your book about burnout. So I thought the universe really had aligned for us both to meet, because I was really starting to notice for myself that I thought, oh, I'm not too sure if I'm becoming burnt out or whether it's too much stress. Or so your book was so helpful, and I wanted to ask you, what made you then hone down on in to want to really write? It's a fascinating book.
Thank you. Yeah, it felt tricky for me to kind of put my hand up and say, I feel like I've got something to say on a topic that's already been written about in different places. But what I was finding was when people off work, unwell with stress and burnout, or coming to therapy with those types of related issues, there wasn't quite the book I wanted to recommend. So I felt that really a lot of the books have been approached, the topic matter had been approached by the more occupational arena, because we'll get into the definition in a minute, but that's where it originated. But a lot of people using the word burnout more generically to cover things like parental burnout and more academic burnout, and carer, informal carer burnout. And so I just thought, actually, my experience as a clinical psychologist has been particularly with people experiencing trauma, and the models I'm trained in, because all psychologists will gravitate towards slightly different models of a therapy. The ones I have got extra training in are very commonly used for trauma presentation. So, for example, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is one of them. And so I thought the way I talk about trauma is so people find it really validating. We also go into a lot more detail about what's going on under the bonnet of your nervous system than I found a lot of the books did, that had kind of useful information about the nervous system as an entry level point. But I thought actually there's a lot of support people get from knowing a bit more detail if they're in that headspace to be able to take it on board, of course.
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe there was space for a book that looked like that gave people a bit more detail, because it takes the pressure off and it supports people to do the tools and practice the tools that, you know, are hard to do in that space. But if you kind of know why they're hard, it helps you stick at them. Um, and I wanted a book that was suitable for men and women as well. I wanted it to be gender, you know, but for both genders. And that's the main reason.
Yes, yes, I can hear. So it's really fits along nicely, doesn't it? With, like you were saying, we're looking at being trauma informed and people becoming burned out, which actually really ties into a little bit of myself. So I know we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think it'd be really helpful for our listeners to know. So I found this fascinating. How do you define burnout?
Do you mean how do I define burnout?
Well, I liked the classification in the book. And so I thought logically, you know, where it all goes through. And I thought, oh, this is fascinating to know that I think you mentioned it as
Yeah.
being a syndrome.
Yes. Okay. So the official definition of burnout came from the WHO, World Health Organization, and ICD-11, talks about it coming from chronic unmanaged workplace stress, and that it's not actually a mental health diagnosis, but it's considered a syndrome, which is when you get a collection of difficulties that tend to arise together.
Yes.
And there's three. So the first is physical and emotional exhaustion. So that's often the bit that most people most easily recognize when, you know, you're just really just beyond tired a lot of the time, but not just physically, but emotionally.
Mm.
Sometimes people refer to this as compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
I talk a bit more about that in the book, don't I?
Mm.
But it can just be irritability, overwhelm, just feeling like you're not actually experiencing the full repertoire of emotions. You're kind of running on empty and it's stuck in a gear that just allows you access to that kind of feeling irritable and tetchy all the time.
Mm.
And your passion for things is just not there.
Mm.
So that's the first. The second one is a detachment. So kind of feeling disengaged from everything, like you're not quite connected to either the people or the work. And it could be feeling of numbness. So this was originally known as detached concern by the psychologist Christina Maslach, who developed this. And she was noticing this particularly in caring professionals, where, you know, they kind of stopped kind of feeling that kind of real concern that they'd had and might have been an important value of theirs why they went into the job in the first place.
Yes. Yes. So that would go with the compassion fatigue, where you
Yes.
notice normally you'd be feeling compassionate and actually it's become sub-zero levels. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last one of the three is reduced personal accomplishment. So this might be a sense of being ineffective. So this is where people kind of telling themselves, oh, I'm no good at this job, or I'm a useless teacher, I'm a useless mom, I'm a useless carer. But it can also be linked with higher levels of mistakes or kind of not achieving because of those other two, where you're kind of exhausted and detached. You might do the things that mean you're not really as engaged with the work, and so what you're doing isn't the same quality as what it was before. You know, maybe cutting corners or not kind of tending to things to the same level of detail that you were before.
Yes. Hey, thank you very much. So what I've been noticing then is, and what I think again is really helpful, is to know that the difference between, I've been trying to work out actually, okay, well, how stressed am I? Or how much is it then is leading into burnout? Actually, I felt quite reassured when I read your book. I thought, oh, perhaps I'm not quite as burnt out as I thought. So that was really helpful. But I could see some of the signs. So could you tell us how it differs, please? So stress to burnout.
Yeah, so this is, I know we're touching more on this in a minute with the nervous system, but if you think about stress as being something that humans actually are built and designed to have in their lives, because when incoming demand is put on us, our bodies can switch to meet that by having more energy pumped into our system, to meet the demand. So this is where we go into something called the sympathetic nervous system, where we might have a lot more energy and motivation, and in short bursts. This is a positive experience for us. Our attention is sharper, our cognitions kind of move into a place where we can kind of quickly problem solve. Our immunity is boosted. So, it's not a bad thing to feel stress. And when, especially if it's on something that we are passionate about, then positive stress has a name, which is eustress. But our bodies aren't designed to be like that for a long period of time. So when we are under chronic stress, and the image I use in the book that tends to stay with people is, if you imagine you're playing a game of tennis and you've got balls at you at a regular interval, when you can return the balls smoothly, essentially you're on top of it, you're within your control, it's not overload, and that's all manageable. But if you imagine that ball machine represents the level of workload at work, say, and then another ball machine is rolled in, and this represents maybe difficulties with an elderly parent trying to meet their needs and tend to their shopping and check they're okay. And then another ball machine is rolled in, and maybe that's your child who's being bullied at school or going through an autism assessment, and suddenly you've got all these ball machines coming at you and you're trying to hit return, and there's no let up. This is a type of burnout called frenetic burnout, where there's no let up. Then all you've got left is to curl into a ball and give up, because there's no other option. So we have this in our nervous system where when we're trying to escape through the fight or flight response of our sympathetic nervous system, if that doesn't succeed, we can move into a place that is about conservation of energy and just kind of hoping the flop will cause the stressor to pass. We see this in the animal kingdom, when a predator is chasing a prey, the prey might just lie on the floor and pretend to stop breathing, and the threat of the chase is over, the predator moves on. So humans don't actually lie down, but we do have similar processes that, in my view, is what's happening in burnout for people when they're really detached and dissociated and not connected and giving up kind of and caring, just kind of coasting and feeling like they're on autopilot. It's kind of a safety defensive mechanism that your brain and body have gone into. So it's kind of a hollow, empty experience, whereas stress is usually quite positive. Stress and healthy stress is quite positive and uplifting, and you can see an end point. Burnout is when you've gone past that, there has been no end point. Your attempts to make address the stressor hasn't managed to work, and yet it's still incoming, and you've got no one to turn to, you feel unsupported, all of this kind of stuff. Overwhelming, isn't it?
It is, yes. I also, when you were talking about the difference in the book, it said that burnout is much harder to bounce back from.
Yes.
And I could see that you said actually when people had clinical burnout, it could take 2 or 3 years for them to recover fully.
You see this a lot in therapy, where if someone's been off work, with any kind of trauma or massive stressor, because it's invisible, they often feel like, I should just kind of do this few weeks of doing, yoga or having a retreat or going on holiday, and I'll bounce back. And actually, you've got to think of it being a journey where you're trying to recover, get your nervous system back up so you're not edgy and jumpy and falling back on the old patterns. And healthy patterns take a long time to get back up and running. So to be really gentle with yourself and to expect it to take a while, which is just a really important message, really, because I think that people are often shocked that it's not a quick fix thing.
Yes. Lots of things are coming into my mind as I'm thinking about. So I think this leads us into talking about how you actually put in the book, don't you? It says how to manage your nervous system before it manages you. And so I love all the analogies that you use about it being the body's command center. So it makes you really able to visualize things and see how things are working.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So when I said lots of things were coming into my mind, I was thinking about myself. And so what I noticed is I'd worked a 12-hour day last week. And by the evening, when I went to talk to my friend, I could hear that I was really slurring. And I thought, goodness me. And so then I went into a state of panic. I was thinking, what's going on with my brain? And so my friend said to me, she said, you're slurring. And so as I was reading some of the signs and symptoms in the book, I found it really helpful when you said about the language center being it's the prefrontal cortex and how it's
Yes.
really impacted. So could you tell us a bit more about some of these key signs and symptoms that people could look out for?
Yeah, well, let's just talk about the Broca's area first, because that's the language center of the brain. And yeah, again, in therapy, we always find that people always find that really helpful because it explains why. So essentially, when we are in our normal rest and digest green mode of our nervous system, business as usual, like we are now, we can communicate with others, read body language appropriately, and the rest of our body is digesting, and we're able to switch off and sleep easily. But when we move into our amber or red, which is the kind of fight or flight or kind of more kind of dissociated, demotivated, shut down place that I described a moment ago, everything in our brain and body shifts into a different gear. And so we're on our high alerts. The amygdala and threat center parts of our brain and body are kind of in charge. And what that means is that the language center, which is housed in the part of the brain associated with our green mode, thinking rational prefrontal cortex brain, it's just not online as much anymore at that point. And it's because it's a slower, more considered way of approaching everything. And really, in a moment like that, your brain's thinking, well, I've got to be quick. I've got to make quick fire decisions. So what that means is quite often, the classic is going into an interview and being asked a question and not being able to eloquently respond. And then coming out of the interview, calming down, and 2 hours later going, I could have said all this beautiful stuff. This is flowing off my tongue now. And it's the same when we're under threat in a traumatic situation. And when you've had, a heavy day for 12 hours non-stop, running on empty by then. And so the access to Broca's area might have been reduced a bit. And so what that means is not just communicating yourself and finding the right words, but also comprehending and following as well, like other people's language. And so sometimes when I'm in that place, I just look blankly at my husband and he'll say, should we have this conversation tomorrow? And I'm like, yes, I'm not computing any of this, and I don't even know what's coming out of my mouth right now. And I forget as well. I don't know if you have that. He'll say, we talked about this. It's like, oh, no record of that.
Yes, so it's really impacting, isn't it, on memory as well, and concentration and being
Yeah.
able to respond. Yes. So I wanted to ask you something else with that too. So I identified with the frenetic burnout.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can tell our listeners a bit more about the frenetic burnout. I was fascinated again. I thought, wow, that's me. That's me. But then, and I felt a little bit worried. I thought, goodness, it said that it can lower your functional IQ by 20%. I was thinking, goodness, this burnout business is real. We've got to do something about this. So, yes, I know
Yeah.
I've fired a lot at you.
Yeah, so I don't want anyone listening to feel scaremongered into thinking I'm now stupid because I can't, because I'm burnt out. This is just temporary. So this is, again, it's the same bit that I was talking about a moment ago, that, your frontal lobes, you don't have all the lovely access to that, the thinking rational brain. You're coming from more of an emotional brain, which is an older part of our system. So, yeah, that's what that means, where functional IQ is not quite as sharp as it would be. And I know everyone recognizes that, because when you look at a question and you're not stressed and you can answer it beautifully, it's that stuff. So it's a bit bigger than language. It's more general, but all of that stuff is housed in the same part of the brain. But yeah, the three types of burnout people tend to find quite interesting. So this came from research into teacher and therapist burnout, that found that actually there were three subtypes of burnout, which we can actually oscillate between different times as well,
Mm.
and that there were different groups who might be more susceptible to different things, different subtypes. So the frenetic is when the demands of work are outweighing the resources we've got, and so the demands are keep coming, and the work pattern just gets to respond faster and faster and work harder and harder. So your work-life boundaries start to slip. Work becomes all-encompassing, and so the people particularly susceptible to this might be those who care really passionately about what they do, but also, you know, where there are things beyond our control, like budget cuts, and you know, expectations around targets being pushed on us, and you know, people early on in their career might be particularly at risk of this, where there's a sense I need to prove myself. So yeah, the frenetic one is the one I think most classically we think of as being burnout. But there are two more which are helpful to hear about, I think. So the under-challenged burnout.
Yeah.
So that's, rather than being overstretched, it's when essentially work has become so monotonous and there's no development, so you're understimulated. So there's a lot of repetition of tasks, and so you begin to feel kind of detached and not like being lit up anymore by your work. And there's different trajectories through those three domains that I talked about. It starts more with detachment rather than the frenetic, which starts more with exhaustion. So the people more susceptible to this might be the really high achieving individuals, who, you know, seek out challenges and thrive on being a bit stretched.
Okay.
Yeah. The last one is worn out burnout. So this isn't so much about volume or work or how stimulating it is. It's more about how aligned it is with your values. And so the example I often give here is of when I was working in the NHS and felt where I'd started off as a clinician offering, we had to offer about 15 appointments a week. By the time a few years down the line, budget cuts had come in and all of this, we were expected to see 25 clients. So it was a jump of 10. And so in order to squeeze all of those people in, we were expected to see them for less time, for fewer sessions. So I had less time to plan sessions or carry out the piece of work that I felt we should be doing for what they presented with. So yeah, the work for me felt very misaligned with my values. And you know, we can move then more into the moral injury side of things, where you might witness or disagree with things and being forced to do things, you know, kind of a sharper end of that, I guess.
Yeah.
And on my social medias, when I talk about this, I think I wrote it in the book, I can't remember, but it really resonates. Like, some jobs I think cover all three. Like, you might have a parent who is, you know, trying to run around for very young children, but also manage a job. So you've got the frenetic element of working hard and all the demands coming in. But at the same time, there's a lot of monotony in like clearing up, cooking again, setting out an activity, rinse and repeat. But then also the worn out misalignment of values means that with all of that, you know, you might really value giving them healthy food, but have just no time in the day. So you're having to, you know, resort to, you know, pre-prepared frozen food. And so suddenly you're into the value stuff there. And so there's jobs like that, like GPs, I think, and other jobs where you might hit all three. So I think it's really, really hard, all the pressures we're under.
Yeah, I think it was really helpful to hear about all three of them as well. And I feel happy to share here. So, what I noticed for myself is that I've used working as a way of coping with, well, obviously, I say use it as a way of coping, not a healthy way of coping. I suppose there's parts of it that's healthy. But so I found I lost my eldest son in December 22. And I think there's a collection of things that have added to where I could use work. So I had to get up out of bed in the morning. I had to earn some money last year.
Yeah.
So I had some pressure, you know, that was good. I needed to carry on. But then what I found is I hit last December, which would be the first month of all of the milestones. And there was about 6 different milestones from the 1st of December all the way through to the end. And So I think what happened for me was I became, and I felt physical pain at
Yeah,
times as well.
yeah.
Really felt even so it would have been his 30th birthday, and I felt labour pains on the day on the 1st of December. So
Mm.
I felt like I survived and I got through. But then all of a sudden, definitely something switched because a friend invited me to go and stay at hers in another country. And I did have a deadline, but from the minute I got onto the plane, I got the laptop out and I worked every day. And I spent
Right.
5 hours on the plane. And I have to admit, I think I've had one break where I can remember having a little rest for a weekend. But other than that, it's as if I can't switch it off. And I know
Right.
this is where I started to look at those where you talk about the green, the amber, and the red.
Mm.
So I thought, goodness, and I know you talk about Gabor Mate in your book.
Yeah.
So I went to see Gabor Mate last
Wow.
week.
Oh, at the
And
trauma conference.
yes, oh no, no, actually, no, he was talking just at a conference in the evening in London.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and so I could hardly sit still. So what he said is, he said that the addiction's not the problem. He said it's the emotional pain that is.
Mm.
And I thought, wow, honestly, I felt like I couldn't sit and listen. I thought, goodness, this is me. So I'm using work and then I'm absolutely burning myself out
Mm.
until, so yes. So I'm wondering what question I'm asking you with that.
But
But
do you know the dual process model of bereavement? Do you know that one?
yes, yes, so
That's
isolating.
yes, that's coming to mind. That there's these two, I don't know, should we try and describe it for anyone listening who doesn't know
Yes,
it?
please. Yes.
So it's a model that suggests there are kind of two different tasks of bereavement. One is around the loss orientation of coming to terms emotionally with the fact that that person isn't here physically anymore,
Yes.
and finding the ongoing attachment relationship with them without them physically being here. And then the other one is around restoration of your life, the other parts of your life, so tending to life changes and doing new things. And I think the I'm putting in inverted commas here, healthy bereavement looks like an oscillation between the two.
Yes.
But I think sometimes you have people come into therapy years after a loss,
Mm.
suddenly realizing it's hitting them, the emotional loss is hitting them because they've managed to kind of just stay with the orientation and not really given themselves any time with the loss orientation because it's so painful, or because, lots of different reasons that people might struggle. We call it experiential avoidance in therapy, don't we, where
Yeah.
emotions are so intense that we might not feel able to stay with them, and so we can use busyness to cope with that, or other things. Drugs and alcohol might take away and numb us, but I suppose a socially acceptable way is to stay busy. And so yes, that's one of the three types of psychological profiles I talk about in the book.
Yes. Yes. And this is what I think, the first half of the book is really looking at the neuroscience, isn't it, with the nervous system.
Yeah.
And then you're looking at the coping strategies, which I think would be really helpful to ask you about. So when somebody is experiencing burnout, what are some of the, ways that you would work with them?
Yeah, so um trying to help someone understand what's gone on for them. It depends on where they're coming at and what level of intervention they're ready for. If we just need to kind of get them pausing and resting and slowing down and pacing, giving them permission to do that, and looking at like what are the things practically that need to happen for that, because the basics need to start getting into place with sleep and rest and things like this.
Yeah.
But then if you can rewind a bit and help someone understand, the recent context, what were the external stressors on them, where are the areas in their life where they have some control over that, but also, further back, what is their kind of backstory, if you like, that
Yeah.
might paint the picture of why they respond to external stresses in their everyday life in the way they do. So, and I give examples of we follow four people throughout the story who have different kind of psychological profiles, but the three main profiles that I think very woven in with burnout is when people aim for perfection, so perfectionism, when people use people pleasing to cope by, keeping others happy, putting their needs last in order to feel like they're an okay person. And then, like we've already said, using work as an avoidance, so keeping busy all the time. And these are all often coming from a place where we want to prevent further harm coming to ourselves. So often there's been some sort of hurt where mistakes weren't acceptable, or we were told we weren't acceptable unless we behaved in a certain way or achieved a certain amount. So having some understanding around that is helpful, and then that supports us to move into developing more self-compassion. And so there are practical things you can do to support yourself. Sorry, my hands immediately went to my heart because
Yes.
yeah, because that's kind of a big part of what you might do. For example, like bringing the flow of how there's three flows of compassion. One is allowing others support in, and people who burn out often struggle with that a lot. So even if help is on offer, they might not see it. If someone says, I can pick the kids up from school, or do you want me to take that off your like that, these might not be happening for people, but be aware that they might be, and we might be closing them off because we have to feel independent, or we don't want to burden others, or we don't want to put ourselves, make ourselves feel vulnerable by allowing that help in this time. There's lots of reasons we don't let that compassion in. So that's one flow. Another flow of compassion is from ourselves to ourselves. So allowing ourselves to be supportive of our own distress and to understand. And often you hear people invalidating their experiences, like, oh, others have it worse than me, or I shouldn't be feeling this. And so, supporting someone to interact with their distress differently. And then the final flow is compassion from ourselves to others. And when we have a relationship with others and we can see others in their own context, that just softens everything and allows, because toxic relationships where we're kind of not able to kind of understand each other's viewpoints kind of can add to burnout quite badly, can't it? And I'm sure you've, in your experience of work, see that as well. So if you can kind of unblock all those flows. So there are opportunities and offerings up in the book of how to do that. There's also, more practical stuff around learning boundaries, retouching with your values to help you reconnect with those. There's lots of options. A bit towards the end of the book, it's more of a kind of like seeing what you need, because some people have strengths, other people won't. But the thrust of the book is to make sure people have a concept of the psychological tools and understandings, rather than a do this, do this, do this. Because once you've got your own understanding of it, then you kind of can see the pathway for you.
Yes, thank you. When you did this, so you talk about the polyvagal theory.
Yes.
And I wanted to really talk about that with you. And so am I right in thinking, when you touched your heart, I'm sure I've seen on Instagram where people do, it's like the butterfly, the tapping.
Yes, I've got some of those videos on my Instagram, actually.
Yes. So I wondered, could you tell us more about, is that linked to the polyvagal theory, or am I
Okay.
getting that wrong?
So they're yes. So polyvagal theory is kind of like a more recent version of what's going on in our nervous system. So, the original theory of stress was that when we are calm, we're essentially in our parasympathetic nervous system. And when we're stressed, we're in our sympathetic nervous system. So research by Stephen Porges and his team in America worked out that actually it's a bit more nuanced than that the parasympathetic nervous system has two branches to it, the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal. And essentially what they found was that the dorsal vagal is this shutdown experience that we go to when we can't escape, the dissociative kind of flopping part. But essentially, the vagus nerve is really vital. It kind of has nerve endings in really important places, and it helps us move. So nerve endings down into the kind of gut and the heart, but also in the periphery, up in our skin, our ears, our facial muscles, our heart area. So when you stimulate those areas of your body in a soothing way, we can send messages of safety to our nervous system.
Yeah.
So I talk a lot about safety in the book, and I go wide as well. I want people to kind of come at the book knowing that I'm not saying this is about just you on your own. I am trying to broaden it out, which is obviously tricky when we have a lot of systems around us that aren't fully in our control. But there are invitations to think about how we can make the places around us feel as safe as possible.
Yes. I
But little,
really loved that.
oh,
Yes.
did you? Oh, good.
Yes. Well, I liked how you said about well, just very simple things, isn't it? About when in your home, what signifies safety. So
Mm.
when things are orderly. And I thought everything really made sense.
Well, because I think sometimes people can feel like, well, that stuff's not important because that's how's that going to help? But what that does is I explain why the nervous system takes cues from that as meaning and everything's okay. Because essentially to rest, which a lot of people struggle with in burnout, we can't really, rest doesn't come when we're tired. Rest comes when we've got permission to switch off. So in terms of evolution and our ancestors, our ancestors weren't able to just rest because they were tired. They had to find somewhere where predators couldn't get them, and they were safe in a cave with a cozy kind of place around them where so it's the same for us with sleep, with rest. Sleep and rest won't come just because we're tired. We have to wind down enough to know that, and now nothing can bother us. We're okay to switch off without anything bad happening. It's just really hard in everyday life when, for example, many people work from home, so the boundaries aren't there. So you're kind of seeing cues of work all the time, and we go to sleep with our phones by our beds, and then we're feeling like, oh, what's coming through now? So the little tweaks, the reason they work, and why psychologists bang on about not putting your phone by your bed and getting a alarm clock instead, and all of these types of things, is exactly that reason, because you're creating a sense of safety, and that allows you to switch off.
Wow. So we don't realize, do we, that it is these cues that are giving us that safety to be able to give us that permission to rest as well. That really makes sense for me. And I'll go on.
You asked earlier how polyvagal links with EMDR.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so the two things are separate. EMDR is a form of therapy that is most well known for the fact that it uses something called bilateral stimulation, which is when we stimulate the left and right hemispheres of the brain in quick succession, which always sounds a bit like woo, but there is science there. So the idea, often we use eye movements, but we might also use hand taps or ear buzzers. And the idea is that supports a natural way that our brain and body process incoming data, and in particular trauma. So we're always processing and making sense of everything. And often in sleep, particularly the REM, rapid eye movement stage of sleep, it's thought to be really important for reducing the emotional intensity of a memory. And it's almost like a kind of filing system that happens at that point of the night, where things are being date stamped, memories being date stamped and filed in a hippocampus. But it's thought that when something's highly disturbing and traumatic, because of the way that our frontal lobes and hippocampus aren't kind of online in the same way as they are when we're not stressed, that doesn't happen. And so you're accelerating in the same way the body naturally does during REM sleep, processing of difficult events using the same REM kind of movement, bilateral of the left and right.
Ah,
So the reason that maybe the two feel very linked is because polyvagal has been used a lot in kind of, it's a trauma theory. So we use it a lot. EMDR therapists often have good understanding of polyvagal, and will think about how to create safety in therapy for somebody using polyvagal theory, like full-bodied safety, and also why someone struggles to engage with the technique can be helpful to know the more nuanced parts of the nervous system. And the other thing to say with the EMDR is that it's an 8-phase model, and early on, one of the phases is to use calming tools to soothe the nervous system. And we often use bilateral stimulation, but in a different way to the trauma part. We use it in a soothing way. So humans find rhythm very soothing. We often rock our babies, or if you think about lying in a
Mm,
hammock or having your hair stroked.
mm,
So they're gentle, slow rhythm.
mm,
When you're doing something like we were doing a minute ago, which is the butterfly hug, which when you've got your hands in front of you, if
mm,
listeners want to try this,
mm.
face palms facing, hook your thumbs, and then place the thumbs and over your the hands over your heart, so your fingers are touching collarbone, and then you can slowly tap at a beat like that. So tap,
Mm.
tap. So it's one then the other, not both at the same time. We would pair that with a calming image, a place that feels special to you, like a. Often people would choose somewhere in nature or with a pet.
Mm.
And then this is a really beautiful tool you can use when you're overwhelmed,
Yeah.
because you can connect more quickly with it. And it's thought that pairing it up with the slow tapping just helps all of your nervous system to kind of breathe out.
Yeah.
And I always also say to people when I'm working with them, the nice thing about having your hands up here around your heart is that it's soothing. That vagus nerve, the ventral vagus nerve up here, is being activated in a really lovely, soothing way, and you're releasing the oxytocin, the warmth of your hands. If you really rest it here, even if you don't tap, just resting your hands here, that's a nice intervention.
Hey, lovely. This is lots of ways of coping, isn't it? Self-soothing for yourself. So I know that you talk about the polyvagal theory. You've just spoken about EMDR. So one
Going to
last question then. I can't believe that our time has gone so quickly. So one last question was, so if you wanted our listeners to take away one key point about burnout away with them, what do you think it would be? I know it's very difficult to say one key point, but one key point of wisdom other than read your book.
that it's not your fault, because I think a lot of people can feel like it's my fault that I can't do the things that might help me, like slowing down and doing mindfulness or journaling and time blocking and pacing myself. It's a sign of where your nervous system's got and how frazzled it is and all the pressures around you that this has happened.
Mm.
And so it's a sign of self-compassion to allow support in, like I've said earlier. So
Yeah.
what will that look like for you, and wherever you are in your journey, to allowing and unblocking that flow of compassion from others? Maybe it is starting with some self-help, like a book, and that's okay as a stepping stone, even if therapy does feel like a jump. And I have had people read my book and then come and say, oh, I feel like I've never considered therapy before. I would consider that now. And other people have just sent me an email, lovely messages saying this has helped me understand myself in a way I didn't understand, and I'm genuinely being a little kinder to myself, which is actually quite a big deal. So yeah, it's not your fault. And get someone in your team if you can as well, because we're constantly bombarded by messages of doing and busyness, and wearing busyness is almost like a badge of honor without realizing we're doing it. I haven't rested, I couldn't say no, all these like little things. And actually, if you can just have someone who gets your journey and where you're at, and that you want to tend to your self-care, you can celebrate. Then you can celebrate. I have someone I text when I said no to something, but most people go, well, why are you celebrating that? That just makes you sound like a horrible person. But I'm like, no, I managed to prioritize me, and I know you'll get this.
Yes. Actually, that reminds me of the joy of missing out.
Oh,
It's very
yes.
difficult to say no, can't it, sometimes? But yes, I definitely think I have JOMO for sure over last year. So, hey, I want to thank you so much. That's been a really helpful conversation. I definitely recommend your book. I learned so much from it and I felt reassured as
Can
well.
I let people know that it's got a different title in America for anyone listening? I don't know if you have an
Yes,
American audience.
yes, little, definitely little. It's definitely becoming a worldwide audience.
So it's coming out in America under the title The Trauma of Burnout in January 2025.
Ooh.
Yes, because that was the original working title because of the marrying up of trauma. But it wasn't a title that the British publishers wanted to go with. They wanted to highlight the subtitle Burnout, how to manage your nervous system before it manages you.
Okay, well, I think they are both brilliant titles. So good luck with that release in
Thank
America
you.
too. And thank you so much, Claire. Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me, Michelle.